Welcome to the 5 More Minutes podcast. Hello, friends. Welcome back. I know it's been a little bit of a long time since you've heard this podcast. We've been on kind of a break. We've gone through a couple of rotations of the flu, a little bit of a research deadline panic. We've had Christmas, we've had New Year's, and honestly, I was just like, I don't know if I can do this podcast. I don't have time, but I've been getting some really great feedback from you, and I am currently in New Jersey with Cousin Paul creating some content, and so he's just like, no, we need to do the podcast. People love the podcast. We're going to do this. So welcome back. We are kicking off 2020 with this podcast. I just came from a tour from Manitoba, and was just like, well, I'm kind of halfway to New Jersey, so just kind of hopped on a little plane. So I've been here for a few days working with Paul, and so this podcast is just me and Paul kicking off the new year. And so we were trying to figure out what we could talk about, and so he's like, what's going on, what are some new exciting things in the life of Shelley Moore? And so I'm just like, he's like, hey, what about the new book that's coming out? I'm like, perfect. So this podcast is me and Paul, and I always get stuck because I'm like, well, what are the questions I'm going to ask? Because Paul's such a conversationalist. So he goes, okay, how about I interview you, and then you can have kind of an exemplar to refer to. I'm like, perfect. So this is kind of like a backwards podcast. So we are going to have Paul interviewing me about the book, so you can kind of hear about the new book that's coming out, and hear a little bit more about Cousin Paul. He's a new dad. And so, we're here. He always makes me work hard when I come to visit. So this is our first podcast of 2020, first of many. Cousin Paul and I talking about the new book. If you don't know Paul or need a reminder, Paul is our editor, producer, and my cousin, who is the behind the scenes of 5 More Minutes, does all the editing for the videos and the podcast and the strategies and the visuals. So he's a big part of the work that we're doing together. So sit back, relax, and hope you have a coffee in hand, or you're in your car, and enjoy my conversation with Cousin Paul. Hi, everybody. Today we're going to do things a little backwards, because usually I interview someone, but I'm trying to still learn to be an interviewer. So I'm actually going to be the interviewee today. And good old Cousin Paul, who is the master of conversation, he is going to interview me about my new book. So let's say hi to Paul. Hey, Paul.
Hello, everyone. Hello, 5 More Minutes.
Right?
World?
Yeah, 5 More Minutes.
5 Minutes World.
We should, it's like, that podcast, My Favorite Murder, they call their followers murderinos. We should be.
Can we just use that?
Murderinos? Or inclusioninos. Inclusionistos. Hey! Inclusionistos?
Not bad.
We'll play with it. So Cousin Paul is here, and this it's so funny because me and Paul we're in contact pretty frequently.
We talk once a week at
totally,
least.
But we live across the continent from each other. It's far away, so often Paul will send me these little texts and be like, hey, Shelley, don't forget to post a story today on Instagram. I'm like, yeah. And
or, hey, Shelley, do you have a podcast to send me?
Like the night before, and I'm like, yeah. And I pretend to have a nap, or I'm actually napping, one of the two. And so this week I'm actually here in New Jersey, where Paul lives.
Just lost the feet, and now we're back.
Okay.
Hop back. There you go.
And so he sends me all of these little messages from afar, and I just, go about my day. And sometimes I do.
Sometimes you reply, sometimes
I don't. Which, is how I roll, but he goes with it.
The one that gets you is, hey, Shelley, is your phone broken?
Yeah. Never. I couldn't survive. So I had some cancellations this week, and so I was just like, hey, you know what? I need to make some more content for our 5 More Minutes video channel. Why don't I come to New Jersey and we could do some filming, which we did yesterday.
Right, because we usually film in batches. So
yeah, like 3 or 4.
Information for people to know. We film 3 or 4 at a time.
Yeah.
When you come out, usually you're in like Wisconsin,
Toronto, or something. Yeah, something
east.
out at least partway here.
Right.
This time was Winnipeg.
Hey, Winnipeg.
And
Is it windy in Winnipeg still?
No, that's Chicago.
I was in Winnipeg once and it was very windy.
Really? Well,
Yeah.
it's pretty flat.
Yeah.
Although, you know what I learned? That windy Chicago is not because of the wind, it's because of the shifty politics.
Oh, that's why it's called the Windy City?
Yes!
I didn't know that.
Who knew?
I thought Lethbridge was the Windy City.
That's actually, they're not very shifty in politics.
No.
They're pretty consistent. But
I had a friend
windy.
Who grew up in Lethbridge. Mm-hmm. He said it was very windy.
Southern Alberta. But it's because of those plains, right?
Right.
So
flat.
So flat.
So back on track.
Yeah.
We make the videos we film.
Yeah.
We go hard and we film 3 or 4 of the episodes. And a lot goes into an episode. It's a lot of setup.
A lot of panicking.
Shelley writes a script. Then you'll read it through and then you'll rewrite the script on the spot. And then...
and Paul's so patient. And then we have a break and go to Panera.
Yeah, we always go to Panera, which is like the Tim Hortons of America.
Well, Tim Hortons is kind of going downhill a bit, so I would say that...
No, take that back.
No, I'm serious.
I love Tim Hortons.
You know what? They're starting to like make weird things like French toast breakfast sandwiches with a donut on top. No.
But it's not good.
No. Tim Hortons, you get a donut, you get a coffee, you get a bagel.
Right.
Done. But now they have these they have French toast fries. Like, no.
Oh, they're trying to
be like Burger King. No,
right.
Enough.
Trying to mix it up.
No. Canadians don't like to mix it up. We like our double doubles. Don't mess with what works.
Keep it simple.
Okay, so Panera.
Back on track. Jeez.
This is why it takes me so long to make content.
It's okay. It's good content. So we film like crazy for a day or two, and then I go into the editing process and I ask for notes and whatnot for the graphics and all that. And it
takes some time.
What are we even talking about? I've completely forgot where are we going with this.
You know what? We were talking about... Oh, okay. So I was saying how I was coming out here to film, but this was the part that I was going to say. So this is the whole filming process, which I'm aware of. Like, I'm pretty aware of what we do.
Sure.
But here's the sneaky part. Because I can't just have a nap because I'm in New Jersey.
Right.
Paul just like pops over. He's like, okay, Shelley, we're getting to work. And I'm like, no, we already filmed. He's like, oh, no. We have podcasts to make.
Podcasts to do.
We have book lists to create on Amazon. We have merchandise we have to create. Like, I
social media strategy.
I get away with nothing when I'm here. So
true.
if you have been...
But we're going to do these podcasts, and then you're going to take a nap.
And then I'm going to take a nap.
Maybe we should go to Panera.
Go to Panera. The broccoli cheddar soup's so good.
It's amazing. But they're productive trips, and we try to get as much content done as we can in bunches so that we can release it and make stuff for everyone.
Because if you know about my life at all, and Paul does.
I do.
Is that I don't have a lot of time.
Right.
You know what I mean? So like the in-between of the travel and stuff, it's very hard to like be like, I need a podcast tomorrow. Who am I going to talk to? Like the flight attendant? Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so if I don't have a lot of content in the bank, it's hard to keep up, which is probably why you've noticed an absence lately.
Right. And so it's been what, since the start of the year? It's been a busy start of the year.
November, I think.
And you had a big, you hosted a lot of people for Christmas.
Yeah, we did.
And that takes a lot out of you.
Yeah.
Hosting's a lot of...
I've realized, though, that, like, because I've moved to an island, too, it's even harder to do things last minute.
Right.
So Paul and I have sat down. We've made a schedule of content.
Yes.
He's very useful.
We're going to put out consistent content.
We're going to have a bank of content. So on those Sunday nights when I'm like, there is no way I'm doing a podcast right now, we'll have one.
I'll have it edited.
In the bank, ready to go.
go.
So we're just trying to kind of create it. Because you know what's happening is I'm going around the world and people are like, Shelley,
where's the podcast? I love the podcast.
And here's the thing, though, about podcasting. Like right now, for example, we are in your mom, my aunt's dining room.
Yes.
There's nobody here.
Right.
It's me and you. And I still, in my head, think, who cares about what me and Paul are talking about? But you know what? People come up to me and they're like, Shelley, we listened to your podcast driving to San Diego.
Right.
And I'm like, that's a long drive. They're like, people listen to this stuff.
People love podcasts.
They love podcasts. So I made some.
So we're going to make a commitment.
We're making a commitment.
For all the people who listen to our podcast.
Yeah. We are going to create content for you.
That we're going to have consistent content. Mm-hmm. That's our commitment. And then what we need from all the listeners and people in the 5 More Minutes community is that we ask everyone to share the content with someone who can find it useful.
Seriously. And you know what someone said to me, actually, which was really neat? Someone came up to me and he's like, you know what's good about your podcast, Shelley? He's like, I don't just share the podcast, I share specific episodes with specific people. And I kind of like that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because I want them to be useful, and sometimes things are more useful. Like the last one we did was with Danielle and Connor, the mom and the little guy with Down syndrome. And people love that. It's a whole bunch of parents really tuned into that one.
So if there was a parent who's going through something similar, they can share that with a friend.
Exactly, which is exactly what Danielle, she's so amazing.
Great.
So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that honestly, this was like a side project to procrastinate my PhD research, but it's actually becoming something that is really useful to people. And so it's kind of bumped up it up on my priority list to be like, this is something that deserves time that's carved out. But I've also realized that the best way to do this is to plan ahead.
Planning ahead. I'm a big planner.
This is why I get things done when I'm with you.
Right.
Because you don't let me just like go watch Mr. Rogers on the couch. You're like, no, get in here. We're doing a podcast. Test your mic.
Well, the thing is, I like to plan, and I don't like doing things last minute.
That's why we're a good balance.
So it balances out. So this will be great. So this is our new.
So this is our kickoff podcast. New Year's resolution podcast. And so then, while we were filming yesterday, Paul's like, "Well, what we were talking about this idea? Like, what should we do for this kickoff podcast?" And I'm like, "Oh, Paul," because you know what he says? He's like, "Why don't we talk about your new book and tell people what it's about?" And I'm like, "You're so brilliant."
So let's get into it.
So Paul's gonna interview me. It all comes back.
Right. So we need to rewind. That was a big surprise. Okay. So.
Oh, sorry.
Right. So we thought, hey, this is a great opportunity because the book's coming up. You know, it's coming out in a couple months. Don't laugh.
It was supposed to, but you know.
Windows
of time. So
Windows of arrival. That's what
I know. This is Windows of book readiness. My publisher is so fantastic, and they're so supportive, and they actually were very smart to pre-release it so that people could pre-order it, but they wanted it to be ready by May, and I'm like, I love you so much, but there's no way. So I've noticed the date on Amazon has been pushed back a bit to February, but I don't think it'll take that long. I want this thing done like
it's coming.
It's coming.
We had a good conversation about it, and it's looking good.
You know what? I'm really proud of this book.
Okay, so let's step back.
Okay.
So what is this book? What's the title?
Okay, so
this is a big reveal, even though everyone reveal. You can find it on Amazon.
Big reveal. So this book is called All for One, and it's actually the first book of a two-parter.
Ooh.
So expect the second book within the next 10 years.
2030.
2030. So this book's called All for One. I'm playing off the theme of one, which the first book is One Without the Other. And One Without the Other, if you've read it, is very much about like anecdotes and stories and kind of what inclusion is. And it was written in 2016, and it's kind of funny because if I were to do a re-release of that, what is that called? New edition?
The new edition, right.
My definition of inclusion would totally change. So it's interesting how...
But it's also kind of your origin story.
It is. That's a good way to look at it.
Like how you got here.
Totally. That's exactly it. It's kind of like, this is what inclusion means to me today.
Right. So let me ask you about that then. So if you were to summarize that book and what inclusion meant to you then, like really simply, what would it be for anyone who's considering to read that book? Because you should definitely read that book.
Yeah, so it's basically broken up into two sections. And the first section is, okay, what is inclusion? And at the time, I would have said that inclusion is, shifting away from how do we include people who are different,
right, to
how do we teach to difference,
okay.
Right? So looking at disability as one of the many things that make us different.
Okay,
right?
So it's kind of focused in on the difference.
Well, it's focusing in on disability specifically as difference.
Right.
And then the second half of the book are basically stories of students and stories of my own life that has helped me understand what inclusion is, but also what it isn't. Like the second half is debunking myths.
Right. And why it's important.
Totally.
Right.
Exactly.
So let me ask you this. If you were to new edition it, what would it...
Well, I can tell you exactly.
And go for it.
Okay. So that book was about... The whole idea is about teaching to diversity. Okay. Right? And this actually leads nicely into the next book, because this is a piece of All for One, which is, if we really want to teach to diversity, we have to know what the diversity of our kids are. But what I'm realizing that's even more important than that is that kids need to know how they're diverse.
Right.
But you can't tell someone that they're diverse.
Right. Ooh,
Right?
Interesting. Yeah.
If people, I remember people telling me when I was young, Shelley, I think you're gay. And I'd be like, whatever.
Right.
You can't tell someone who they are.
Right. They have to figure out.
They totally have
in
to.
Their
They
own
have to. It's a journey, right?
Yeah, sure.
And so I actually am realizing, like, can we actually teach to diversity if kids don't know who they are?
Right.
And so then the question is, well, how do we support kids to know who they are?
Sure.
And so now my whole understanding of inclusion is not just teaching to diversity, but teaching to identity.
Oh, interesting.
Right, helping kids to figure out, like, the dots, what their colors are. Right, and then to kind of build on that is, okay, so if we're helping kids to figure out who they are without telling them, but really making it safe for them to discover that on their own.
Right.
Then the next part is well, how do we then learn from difference?
Right. So it's kind of walking the line between, teaching to someone who has a different need, but it's not a secret to that person.
Well, and that's a good point, because for a long time, and even with my own experience, no one tells you why something's hard for you.
Right.
Right?
Right.
And so in the disability world, and still is very much the case, where people don't tell kids that they have a disability.
Right.
Because for a lot of people, we see that as a burden or something we want to fix.
Sure.
As opposed to, like, the disability community is kind of pushing back and being like, no, I'm autistic.
And that's okay.
And that's okay. Just like,
let's figure out how to make this work for me.
You're a person of color. Great.
Yeah.
Oh, and you're from, you know what I mean? Like, it's looking
Sure.
at it as an identity in the same way that we look at any identity.
Right,
It's not
right.
something that we need to hide. It's something that we need to know about ourselves.
Right.
And so that, if I were to say, what is inclusion now? It's even bigger than disability. It's saying, how do we help kids to know the parts of them that make them who they are?
Right.
And know that it's okay.
Right. And then as for people who are giving support to those people, to understand how to pivot and understand and support in a different way.
To them, yeah. Without the goal being to change them.
Right.
Or fix them, which is very much that medical model of disability that we're trying to push against with the content we're creating.
Right. Oh, very interesting.
Fun, right?
So would you say the first book was a door with one hinge, and the second book is the hinge, the second hinge to the door?
The first book is one door. The second book is double doors.
Oh, that's great.
Beautiful French doors.
And so the third book.
Okay, so here's the thing. Inclusion's a moving target.
Sure.
So
it's always going to change.
If we have this conversation again in 5 years, I'll have another evolution of this, right?
Right.
But kind of connecting then to the second book, what the first book doesn't have that the second book is going to have is really the how, right?
Okay.
So the first book is looking at, like, what is this and why is it important? But it doesn't really have a lot of, like, practical strategies.
Sure.
And so this is what these two kind of partner books are going to be, is how do we do this in ways that honor diversity and identity. From an ability and disability perspective, but not limited to that.
Right. I think the interesting part, as an outsider, I'm not an educator, but coming to understand what inclusion is more, is that the idea that we're not all the same, and so you can't just batch educate people.
Well, exactly.
So that's probably been the most interesting thing, because from an outsider perspective, just someone who was, went through public school and whatnot, and everyone had to do everything exactly the same way. Everyone's plan was the same thing. I think that's probably the hardest thing to get your head wrapped around, is that maybe that batch education,
doesn't make sense.
No, like casting a net, just then seeing what you catch, it's
totally.
kind of,
Actually, I want to do another podcast with you.
Sure.
Which is, what has Paul learned from this?
Sure.
You know what I mean?
We'll do it.
Because, like, when we started this, you had your educational experience.
Sure. Right. Yeah. And I had limited, I didn't even know that
this whole world existed.
Well, who even knows that?
Well, exactly.
That things could change or be better.
You really know what you know.
Yeah, and I could have benefited greatly from probably a different system. I'm very artistic, so we'll get into this later. But even I remember I was in third grade and I was doing just my letters, or second grade or something like that. And I was doing my letters, and the teacher didn't like how my letters looked, and so they tried to help me figure out how to write my letters better. But what they didn't realize is that as a child, I was a gifted drawer. I was great at
You were
sketching.
trying to make it interesting.
I was making it interesting, and no one took a second they just thought, oh, you don't do it like everyone else.
Right.
There's something wrong with you. You're broken.
Which is exactly how we look at kids in school.
Right.
Right. Which is, and this is, I mean, if you kind of really dig into this inclusion initiative, that's the element that we're trying to push against.
Right.
Is that if we're really going to teach to the diversity of our kids, we cannot assume that the goal is for them to be the same.
Right.
Because then that's not diversity, that's assimilation.
Right.
Which is the total opposite of inclusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this book, you dive more into IEPs.
Yeah. So the first book is.
And actually, let's describe what an IEP is, because I recently learned doing a video having to like spell out the acronyms.
I know, poor Paul. I'm just like, here's the acronym. He's like, great. What does that mean? Because there's a lot of acronyms in education.
There's a ton of acronyms.
So before I tell you, so there's two books here that are going to be going together, and they're both about the how from two perspectives. Because before I get into the IEP, I have to tell you this, is that in education, there's two really big, like, silos. Okay, so there's the curriculum side where your classroom teachers are, and then there's the special education side, which is your kids with disabilities. Okay,
right.
and historically they're very, very separate.
Right.
And so IEPs, or individual education plans, have very much come from the special education side.
Sure.
And then the curricular plans, or the classroom plan, comes from the curriculum side.
Right.
And there's it's very problematic because these people don't often talk to each other, or they haven't historically.
Right.
But also IEPs, which these individual education plans, when they were originally designed, they weren't designed to be applied to a classroom, right? Okay. And so this is a very, very long, because basically what an IEP is, it's for a student that, doesn't fit into a classroom plan, right, for whatever reason. Historically, it's been because you have a disability, right?
Right.
So then you have this individualized education plan that kind of, it's supposed to be integrated with the classroom, but really it runs parallel.
Okay.
Because it's not very common, or it's not very often that it's built with a classroom plan. It's very, very much... It's separate, and it's applied to an already existing classroom plan.
Okay, and once it's going, don't touch it, just let it be.
Well, that's the sad part, is that, I don't think that's how it was designed, but these plans, which are supposed to be for these individual kids so that they show growth according to their own continuum, right, have really, what they've become are these very, very heavy accountability and policy documents that are no longer plans.
Right.
Right.
So you're taking benchmarking and all,
seeing where
people are.
And this is, it's like you're taking these kids that already aren't average, and you're trying to figure out where they fit within a standardized system, and then trying to fix them to make them fit. It's so backwards, right?
Right.
And so,
So even an individual plan for an individual is, the underlying goal has become to
be
just
the same.
Assimilate into the rest
for
of
sure.
them. When that's just not possible.
It's not, and it's
I don't know if you realize this about humans, but everyone's different.
Everyone is different. But it's also changing the goal away from the goal isn't to be the same.
Right.
And that's a fundamental shift in education, right? And so individual education plans, if you've ever made them, I'll tell you what happens. What's supposed to happen is, stakeholders come around, and together, including the student and the family and the teachers, everyone comes together, and we create this individual plan that reflects the needs of this particular kid. What actually happens in reality, though, is that, I worked in a high school, so when a teacher has 210 kids on their caseload, they're not going to show up for an extra meeting to talk about one kid to see how they already, it's not practical. Elementary, it happens more, the collaborative design.
Right. But also, and parents are in a different place when their kids are in elementary school, in that they're 100%. Very engaged.
Well, and a lot of the parents that
I'm not saying high school parents aren't engaged, but
I'll tell you what happens to parents in high school. It's one of two things happen. Because I worked with parents from grades 8 to 12, and one of two things happen. Either they become the super advocates, or they get tired of fighting and not getting their kids' needs met, right? And so a lot of the parents that I had were incredible parents, but this book will take you through this process, but I interviewed a whole bunch of parents for my master's graduate work, and parents were just we're so tired of coming to meetings to be told and reminded of all the things our kids can't do.
Right.
It's just we know what our kids can't do, telling us the things that they need, supports that they're not going to get, we would rather just do what we do, it wasn't useful, which is the big conversation that came out of all of these interviews is there's so many resources that go into these individual plans that aren't even plans, they're policies.
Right.
Right? There's so much resources, time, people, funding that go into creating these, but they're not useful to anyone. They're not useful to classroom teachers. They're not effective. They're not efficient.
Right.
But we do them because that's what's been done.
Right.
And so this book is basically the story of British Columbia and how we kind of, like, the group of teachers kind of came together and we're just like, there's got to be a better way to use these resources, because the underlying elements of an IEP, there are very important elements. Like, we need to be accountable to these students, right? It's, I've never met a person who knows what every single kid needs in the diversity continuum.
Sure,
you know what I mean?
Impossible.
And so it's definitely a plan that can help people to see, like, hey, well, what does a student with Down syndrome need that's different than someone who doesn't have it? Like, things like that, right? I think it could be a very informative document that is useful to create a plan, but that's not how they're used. They're very much used to drive funding, to drive assessments, to drive. They've become a very politicized document.
Right.
That is it's moved so far away from actually helping the kid.
Right.
That parents are frustrated, kids are frustrated, teachers are frustrated,
and no one's getting support.
No one's getting what they need, and it's pulling the resources that could be used to actually support kids in classrooms. Right.
So let me ask you this then.
Yeah.
So brief. Why are they useful?
Okay, so what they could be useful for, I think, is, again, and you have to look at this in terms of context. I think if you look historically, kids in a segregated, self-contained setting where everybody in that setting has an IEP, they might be useful because often it's a very one-to-one setting or a small group, kind of 2 or 3 to 1 setting. Mm-hmm. But in a classroom, that's not the same context, right? Like, not everybody in a classroom has an individual education plan, and that's also not the goal. Right. And so they've kind of created these documents that are not meant to work with other documents and taken them and applied them to an already existing classroom plan. Okay. As opposed to what I think they should be useful for, which is how can a classroom teacher look at an IEP and say, how is this going to inform my classroom plan for everybody? Right. Not something we're going to apply afterwards, not something we're going to do parallel, but how does this document give me the information I need to plan for this entire community, right? Okay.
So it's more of an opportunity to look at the data and assess and be more
look at the data, but also look at the kid to be like, so yes, like, because there's very useful data, but this is the other thing too, is that very often you lose the story in the data.
Oh, interesting.
Right? And so some of these things can't be quantified. And so this is one of the parts of the IEP that we also notice, is that these documents have become so policy kind of
heavy laden,
that you lose the story of the kid and the family in there, right? Like, who are these people that these documents are representing? And so the other thing I think they're really useful for is, how can this document not lose that face?
Right. So do you find that, I could imagine, with any school system, the handoff between grades, that's already difficult.
Absolutely.
So do you think there's a way to use IEPs to help assist that?
Well, and I think this is actually a big question for all kids too, which is, these IEP documents that are designed for a year, right? The transition from year to year to year often isn't very clear, which was another piece of feedback from parents. Like, these just, all that changes is the date. Is what one parent said. Right. Like, what's the actual progress? But that's a big question for kind of all kids. Like, how are all kids progressing over time, over like the bigger window of grades? And this has been a question that's come up a lot in terms of assessment in general for all kids, and how do we keep track of what kids have done and where they are in the school continuum, not just a grade continuum or a unit continuum?
Wouldn't it be funny if instead of, growing up, you hear like, oh, this is going on your permanent record. Oh. But wouldn't it be great if the permanent record was like your story on how you learn?
Wouldn't it be beautiful? And you know what? And I think like there's been different initiatives to try and do that. Like, this is my learning story. Right. And the more that we're getting okay with the fact that these stories don't have to be the same, the more it's allowing kids to be themselves, right? Sure. But then how do you capture that? How do you capture that story?
We should make an app.
Well, funny that you say that, because technology is making this possible.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if you look at, districts that are very forward thinking, a lot of the infrastructure for all kids to capture their learning story is portfolios, so as opposed to these standardized exams of do this, do this, do this, do this, how do we capture the learning story of these kids through a portfolio assessment, which is beautiful.
Oh, that'd be great.
And lots of districts are moving that way. But then here's the thing, Paul.
Yes.
Students on IEPs who would really benefit from this learning journey are still very much assessed according to quantitative statistics of observations. And so it was kind of like, if all kids are moving to learning journeys and like stories of how they're progressing, why aren't the kids who probably would benefit from that from the most also not doing that? And so it's bring up a whole assessment question of, why isn't the assessment on IEPs the goal? Like all of the things that make an IEP aligning with kind of the research-based methods of how we're teaching and assessing all kids. Right. It's still this, like, so imagine you have a classroom and you have these beautiful portfolios of kids showing their learning in different ways. And then you have this IEP document that relies on quantitative evidence of SMART goals for this one kid.
Right. You can't put they don't work together.
They're completely counteractive learning theories.
Sure.
So like it is absolutely no surprise at all that a teacher would look at that document and being like, I'm not even going to read it. Like it doesn't help me at all. And I would actually rather do portfolio with this kid than to like spend time doing tally marks on how many times they raise their hand. You know, like it doesn't align. And so this was a huge part of this book. It's like, okay, because in BC, I don't know if you know, but in British Columbia, and this is happening all over the world, there's a huge curricular reform, right? Because we're realizing a few things about kids, and we've made some videos about this, which is, you know, the skills of society today are changing. They're not like they were in the Industrial Revolution. And so this is causing a huge curriculum reform because even kids that do everything right and get 99% are getting into the world and having a hard time.
Sure. You see it. I see it so much in my circles of, you know, I'm 36. Yeah. And I see it like crazy. Yeah. I was like, I can write a 5-paragraph essay. Sure. But I don't know how to take the SkyTrain. Right.
You know, like the skills are really changing. And so this curriculum, this shift in curriculum is trying to align more with, they call them kind of 21st century skills of learning. Right. And the thing about this curriculum shift, which is why it was significant, is this wasn't just an update. Because so usually with curriculum, they'll be like, oh, we're going to update math. Or we're going to update art, you know? Sure. But this was everything changed at the same time.
An overhaul.
And when everything changes at the same time, they're not just changing what is the curriculum, they're changing how we use curriculum. Right. Like it's a paradigm shift. Sure. And so this was a huge opportunity to say, okay, well, if everything is changing, why don't IEPs also change? Right? And so all of the curriculum and the IEP came out, and the new IEP came out, and we're like,
that's it?
This is worse. This is, you
know
really?
What I mean? Was like
that
much worse?
Well, it was the exact same as it always has been. And I'm just like, well,
just because we've done it the same way doesn't mean it has to stay the same way.
Like, so the ministry in British Columbia is on an island off of Vancouver. So I always make the joke, like, I swam to Victoria for this fight. You know what I mean? Because that's how much it was worth to me. Right.
And this is not a metaphorical island. This is an actual.
It would take days, but it's worth it that to me around this idea of like, why this is like, it's the perfect opportunity to change how things are done and change how resources are used. And then it came out, we're like, it was like, just like a punch in the gut.
So would you say in this book, you start to outline maybe what it could be?
Well, that's exactly it. So the book, like this book started 10 years ago when this curriculum design started to be like a group of teachers at our school were like, no, like there's got to be a better way. And districts kind of came together, and over that 10-year process, over 30 districts were involved. Wow. That was totally like it wasn't from the top down. It was totally a grassroots movement to be like, this has to be different, right? And so the book is that story.
It's the hands-on.
Right. And then the feedback that we got from districts and just the process of what would an IEP look like if it was aligned to the curriculum design elements of today, not 50, 100 years ago, right? And so some of those elements are exactly this idea, like, you know, rather than an IEP being this thing that we apply afterwards, what if an IEP was a part of the curricular design for everybody, right? What if IEPs, instead of just being implemented in one place, actually anticipated to be implemented in many places, which is what the point of inclusion is, right? Like, we want kids to be included in as many places as possible. You know, what if an IEP, instead of being written for a kid, was written by a kid? Oh, interesting. All of these things, and having that family and that kid voice. And so this is very, very much the story of that, and kind of where it is a specific to British Columbia story, but when you kind of zoom out and see the big ideas, you realize that this is not unique to British Columbia.
Right. There's
these principles are like they're important to all kids, right?
Right.
And so it's definitely bigger than British Columbia, but I think it's important to hear where it came from, which was where British Columbia is. So yeah, that's it, Paul. That's the kind of big picture of the book, is the story and the what might this look like.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to. Can I get a copy? Should I pre-order it?
You know what? You can.
On Amazon.
You can pre-order it on Amazon.
On your new Amazon storefront you made. You're very excited about it.
I made book lists.
I know.
People are very excited about it.
It's very great. Check it out. Where can they find your book
You know what?
list?
I posted them on every single YouTube video.
Okay. So just go to a YouTube channel. Yeah.
You'll see the link
Just
there.
do it. Okay. And if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, go do it now.
Oh, totally.
Everybody.
It's so fun.
Just go do it.
Be a part of our neighborhood.
Yeah. You're saying neighborhood because you watched the Mr. Rogers movie.
Well, and did you hear what your little nieces call each other? They were playing.
No.
So Annie, Paul's sister, has 4 girls, and so Layla and Adeline.
They're 5 and 4.
Yeah, we're playing, and Layla goes, "Come on, neighbor," and Adeline's like, "Okay, neighbor." That's what they're calling each other now when they play.
Do you know why?
Well, they set up a fort upstairs that was their workstations, and so I think they were like
neighbors.
Their neighbor at their workstation.
Isn't that so sweet?
Isn't that cute?
Those girls.
So cute.
All right, so let's get back on track.
I love getting back on track.
Who is this book for?
That's such a good question.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so here's the thing. When I wrote One Without the Other, this is the first book I've ever written.
Right.
Because
you have your whole life to write your first book.
Right? Yes. That would be a great t-shirt.
Yeah.
You have your whole life. Anyways.
I say that because I used to be a musician.
Yeah.
I guess, are you always a musician?
Absolutely. It's an identity.
Well, I was making albums and stuff, and that's what everyone says, is that you have your whole life to write your first record, and you wrote it, and it went great, and
there you go.
And then they say, okay, make another one, and you're like, oh boy.
Well, and this is the thing, like, I never viewed myself as a writer. Like, if you know my story, you know that writing's very hard. But here's the thing, is with this book was simply like, that first book that I wrote was very much like, okay, what do I think? Here are some blog journal entries, and I'm just going to get it out. And I never anticipated people would actually like it. Like, who's going to read what I think? Sure. But what ended up happening with this book is that because I wrote how I talk, it was really accessible to people. And so because I mean, I guess I was thinking I was writing to teachers. Right. Do you know what I mean? I don't know, like someone who was like me.
Right.
But what ended up happening was, because of the style, it's not very formal. Right. It became very, very accessible to like educational assistants and to parents. And I've been getting emails like kids are starting to read it. And I never anticipated these audiences. So if you asked me who my audience was like 5 years ago, I'd be like, oh, this is for teachers, classroom teachers and support teachers. But I'm like, who knows? I think that parents, I think it would be a good book for parents, because I think also sometimes parents are told to advocate for things that maybe don't align with current practices or beliefs, right? Right. And so I think it'll help parents to know what to advocate for their kids in an inclusive system. I think that self-advocates could probably, I'm hoping that self-advocates, because I'm including some advocates in the book, will see their stories reflected in ways. There's an amazing quote called "Nothing About Us Without Us," which I hold near and dear to my heart. And so I don't want this to be a book that's just something you do to people who have disabilities, but something that is a part of their story, and their voice is in there too. So I'm trying to include people with disabilities, students, teachers, even like consultants, administrators, all of those voices in the book, so that people can see themselves somewhere in those pages.
So it's very relatable.
I hope so.
And you want people to feel that it's accessible to where they're at.
Yeah, like I've even asked like a 9-year-old to write a little thing, you know what I mean? Because I want people to be, and maybe not the whole book will be relevant to everyone, but I want people to find pieces that will speak to them.
Oh, that's great. I think in the world we're in right now, it's more important than ever for us to all gain perspective from everyone, no matter what.
Well, and that's that like teaching to identity piece is, well, you know who you are, but do we know that the goal is not to make someone like us? Right. Or is the goal to learn from someone who's different? Which I think is really what I'm learning. Sure.
It's funny that that's a tough turn, I think, for culture sometimes, because just our Western culture is built on assimilation.
Exactly.
We're all part of a war culture. whether you like it or not. We were, that's just where
North
it came
America
from.
is created out of assimilation, right? And so to push back on some of these like huge fundamental beliefs that are very problematic and be like, okay, well, how do we change the school system when this is also society that needs to be pushed back a little bit?
But the great thing about this and kind of the opportunity for the book and the 5 More Minutes kind of community is that I believe just because things are the way they are doesn't mean they have to stay that way.
Totally.
And 2, I didn't say 1, but I'll say 2 now, is that why not? Why can't we be better?
Well, exactly.
Why not?
Right?
There's no reason.
There's no reason. There's a quote that I love, and it says, the most dangerous phrase is we've always done it this way.
Oh, isn't that the truth? And I think that's applicable to everything.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have this book coming out. So this is the order. Everyone go read the first book, One Without the Other, and then pre-order the second book, which is called
All for One.
And then we're going to read that book. We're all going to get better at this
supporting
thing called
individuals.
exactly. Yeah. We're all going to be supportive and into it, and then open-minded, change our perspectives.
Everything.
Even if people just can start to understand.
Just think about it.
You don't have to. You don't have to dive in.
No.
You don't have to say, this is who I am now. Just say, I appreciate your perspective.
That's it. Done.
Wouldn't the world be awesome?
Well, you know what? This is really funny because this is coming up a lot lately. Like, just being willing to listen is the easiest and the hardest thing to do. It's the hardest because you can't force someone to do it.
Right.
But it's the easiest because it costs nothing.
Right.
It requires zero resources. To just have an open mind.
Right. And just
listen.
See, that's who I am.
That is so who you are.
I like to listen to people.
You are a listener.
I like to talk to people. The thing is, if I don't listen, I can't share my perspective.
Yeah.
And I don't really, I'm not a big, no one has to believe or think the things I think or believe in, but I want people to know who I am. Yeah. That's why it's important.
Yeah.
Because if you understand what I am or who I am or where I come from, then I think you'll be better for it and I'll be better for it, because when I share, it only solidifies who I am more.
Totally.
But if I share and then listen, then I can gain perspective and hopefully become better.
This is actually also a really good balance because I'm a talker.
Sure.
And I listen to respond, and you listen to hear, or whatever. You're here to listen, and I'm here to respond.
Right.
It's a good balance.
It is.
Now, I want to interrupt this for a second.
Okay.
Because Paul and I have been trying to brainstorm, because Paul's designed to be a podcaster.
This is true.
You are made for this medium, and here you are.
Because if there's one thing I do, and I wish I could make a career out of it, is that
conversations.
I'm a conversationalist.
Oh,
it's what I do. 100%. I talk to people, and I'm a storyteller.
Yes.
So if I could get a job where I'm public speaking,
that's like me.
Doing what you do.
Yeah. Well, this is this is our new plan.
Sure.
For Paul.
Here we go.
Okay.
This is the first time hearing of it.
No, you'll recognize
it
because we talked about this last time I was here. Tell me, listeners, if you think this is a good idea. Okay. So Paul, I learned from him so much because he's this conversationalist, and I'm actually not a very good conversationalist. I'm going to stand up on stage and tell stories, and if someone actually asks me a question, I turn into this introverted mumble jumble. Okay. So Paul, though, he is super you can go up to anyone. You're like your dad. You can go up to anyone on the street and be like, hey, tell me who you are.
Right.
Let's take this moment and learn from each other. And so 2 years ago, I gave the whole family a game. Do you remember this?
Yes.
It's called the Hookah Game.
Yes.
Now, we're Danish, so hookah is a big deal.
Right.
Go Google it. But it's basically the sense of cozy, warm, family, time together, conversation. There's a whole bunch of
connectivity.
There's a whole bunch of words to describe it. And so this game is a bunch of cards that have conversational questions.
Right.
So we want Paul to do a podcast about Hookah, where you have conversations based on those conversation cards. I think it's so smart.
I think it would be smart too. I think it's finding the right people. Mm-hmm. I know some interesting people. I think that would be down. So I'll start it. I just need to think of a name, and then I need everyone who listens to this to subscribe to it.
I'll keep you posted.
There we go.
When I was in New York a couple of visits ago, there was a guy sitting on Union Square at a little desk with a typewriter, and it said, on-demand poetry, $1. You could have like a little desk that says, want to be on my podcast?
Sure.
Come have a conversation. Totally
Sure.
free. And it would just be like random New Yorkers. It would be like
That'd be
Honey,
interesting.
but with conversations.
That'd be interesting for sure.
Yeah.
And I have a very interesting circle of friends.
Yeah.
That I think would lend some interesting.
You could like go set up outside of Trader Joe's and be like, want to be on my podcast?
That's true. Oh, actually, where I live, it would be the worst. It'd just be a bunch of angry. I live in a town of commuters. They all commute to New York, and they're just the meanest people.
Mad and mean.
Everyone's so angry, just so mad.
Maybe they would have good stories.
Maybe, who knows?
Okay, so the follow-up book to this. So
Yes.
The first book, so we have one without the other.
Yeah.
And then this one is, so the next two books are about the how. So the first one is All for One,
Sure.
Supporting Individuals in an Inclusive Classroom.
Right.
Okay. Because you need both perspectives to do this. So the first one is, how do I support an individual? And the second book is, well, how do I support a classroom of individuals? And so
Right.
the first one is the perspective of a student who needs additional support. And the second book is, okay, well, if I'm a classroom teacher and I have students who have IEPs, how do I include those as a part of my plan for everybody? So
Right.
they're going to go hand in hand very closely together.
Okay.
And kind of about this idea of learning from each other, I'm hoping that, classroom teachers will read All for One and support teachers will read. So the second book is All for One and the second one is One for All.
Oh, that's perfect.
Right? So they go together because its idea is like, how do we support all the places for one kid?
Right.
And then the second one is All for One, One for All, which is how do I just make one plan for all kids, right? So it's
great.
this kind of universal design approach to be like, okay, it's okay that you have difference in your classroom.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily mean that every single kid needs an IEP, but if you do have IEPs, how do you use that to still only make one plan? Because like nobody has time to make more than one plan. No teacher I've ever met has time to make more than one plan. So how
Right.
do we use that information to design for the diverse community that you have?
Love it.
That'll be out in 2030.
Yeah. 2035 now.
2035.
Since we've taken so much time on this podcast.
It's so fun. Okay.
So this is my last question.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great one for people to hear your perspective on.
Okay.
But then also I would hope that everyone's listening. If you're listening to this, you're probably down with inclusion,
I hope so.
right?
Yeah.
Or at least trying to figure out where you fit in the world of
totally and
inclusion.
how to do it.
Sure.
Yeah, totally.
So I would love to hear your perspective, but then I want everyone who's listening to
Yeah.
take this question and think about
it.
and apply this to their journey.
Yeah.
Whether you're a parent, teacher,
As
whether
you're driving to work, driving to California, whatever
driving
you
to
do,
San Diego,
sitting on a plane,
Sure.
think about this question.
think about this question. So what is your big dream
Okay.
with inclusion? And then also to tag on to that, what's your big dream? And then what's your big vision for inclusion?
Okay. That's it. Okay.
So everyone write that down.
Yeah.
Take out your phone.
What's your dream?
What's your big dream?
What's your vision?
And what's your vision
Okay. So
for inclusion?
for inclusion. So I have two answers.
Go for it.
So when I think about inclusion, I think of inclusion in two ways: the philosophical understanding and the practical implications. Okay. And sometimes those are very far apart, right? And so I think sometimes people get really wrapped up in the why it's important, but then they don't know how.
Right.
Or they get really wrapped up in the how that they forget why it's important.
Okay.
Okay? And if you lose the why it's important, it's very easy to also then stop doing the how.
Kind of, that's how we got where we're at now.
Exactly.
I guess, right?
And because if you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, it's very, very easy to find the reasons why you shouldn't do it. Right? Like
Right.
there's a million reasons why we shouldn't do inclusion. There's a million.
Right.
But this is about how do we find the reasons why and how it can. And you can't do that if you don't know why we're doing this in the first place.
Right.
Okay. So my first dream is on the practical side. My vision is that this inclusion process, or like teaching to diversity, and I really believe this, if we're really going to make this shift, that this is actually becomes easier than what we're already doing. Like that this process of designing for and allowing kids to be diverse without assimilating them becomes an easier process than the factory model of trying to make everyone the same. Because
Right.
we have to be able to have people who don't believe in inclusion look at the process and be like, I want to do that. That's easier.
Right.
So that's my practical dream.
Okay.
And so I really believe that it's possible, but it's different than what we're doing.
Okay.
Okay? It's not more work. but it's different. Okay. Right. Number 2. And this is the story. This is a story that I'm going to share because this just happened last week.
Okay.
And I think it really sums up the second piece, which is if you lose track of the why,
right.
You don't know what to advocate for. You don't know what the how is. Okay.
Right.
So I was recently invited to speak. So basically February is Alberta's teacher convention month. And so there's a whole bunch of huge conferences in Calgary and Edmonton. And so there's a lot of us speakers who kind of do like the Alberta convention tour.
The circuit.
And it's huge. Like when I was in Calgary, like I spoke with Arlene Dickinson from Dragon's Den. Like these are like big speakers, right? There's 2,000 people in the session. Like it's just massive, okay? It was probably the biggest audience that I've ever had. And so I did that, had a great time. But then also if I'm in the city already, often some local organizations will say, hey, why don't you come out and do an evening session or whatever? So this happens a lot. So on this particular evening, which was just a couple weeks ago, I was invited to present to an organization that supports families who have children with Down syndrome. Okay. So it's not like a segregated program, but it is a supplemental support for families. So they have so it's their evening programs. There's some day programs.
And this is mainly for the parents?
It's for both.
Oh, really?
For parents and for kids. It's a really lovely community, actually.
Shout out
to Prep. And so I go, and this session is for parents. Okay, so there's probably, I would say, 150 people. Really nice snacks, samosas, chicken wings.
Sign me up.
They did it up. Beautiful view of Calgary.
Oh, nice.
You're from Calgary.
My hometown.
Totally.
Go Flames.
Yeah, go Flames. And so I'm there, and so this is the first time many of them have seen me, right? And I love talking to parents because like they live this every day. Do you know what I mean? Like parents get inclusion because you're not going to segregate one of your kids for breakfast. You know what I mean? Like
sure.
They have to be inclusive because they're your kids.
It's
right.
Life.
And so I can understand that parents get really frustrated when, you know, they grow up with these kids who are just their kids and all of a sudden they go to school and now these kids are now different.
Right.
Than the rest. Like, you know, so there's a struggle there. But parents also don't have often like the background research and understanding and pedagogy of where inclusion came from and why we need to do it. Right. So these parents are there and we're together for about 2 hours. And so I tell them the spiel of why inclusion matters to me and we have lots of talk time or whatever. And we get into you know, how is inclusion often misunderstood, right? Because the biggest misunderstanding is that inclusion means we're just forcing people together in the same room and we're just going to make it work. But it's not. Like, you can't just physically exist somewhere and you be in a community, right? Like you have to build it, okay? So we have this incredible night. We laugh, we tell stories, but the big part of that night was understanding the why and what inclusion is today,
right?
Which is different than when it was 5 years ago, which is different than it was 10 years ago. So for parents, this is important because sometimes parents get information where it's like, I'm advocating for the inclusion of 5 years ago.
Sure. Not
the inclusion of today. So that was really like, what does inclusion look like today?
Right.
And how do we advocate for inclusion today?
Right.
Okay. So anyways, great session. We had a great time. So parents are coming up to me and there's some self-advocates there. We're doing photos and stuff. And then this couple came up.
Well, how many people were at the session?
Like 150.
Okay, thank you.
And I have a plane to catch, so I don't have a lot of time.
Right.
Okay. And then this young couple comes up to me and they're super young. Like new, like married within 5 years.
Okay.
They're babies.
Right.
They're babies. And they come up to me and dad's really tall, pretty quiet. And then the mom is just like, thank you so much. Like, we have a 3-year-old. We love her. She's amazing. The dad's kind of still being a little quiet. And then he kind of looks at me. He's like, I'm sorry if this is weird. I'm like, what? And he goes to me, he's like, I have to tell you something. And I'm like, okay. He's like, our daughter is included. And it's great.
Right.
He's like, because people tell us that inclusion is good. But he goes, I didn't know why it was good.
Oh, really?
You know? And he looks at me, he's just like, I didn't know why it was good. And now that I get it, he goes, and he starts to tear up a little bit. He's like, this was like church.
Right.
You know what I mean? He's like, I realized that the why is spiritual, you know? And he goes, I didn't even realize that connection. He's like, we're very faithful people, right? And he goes, and I didn't see inclusion it was disconnected from our faith. And he
Right.
goes, and he's like, what we realized tonight is that like this is our faith.
Right.
Because a big part of the conversation does our practice or how we live align with what we believe?
Right. Yeah.
And he goes, he's like, we knew it was important because people told us,
right,
but we didn't know that it was it's part of our fundamental belief system of who we are.
Sure.
And he gets so choked up. He was so cute. And I'm like, I have to hug this man.
Sure,
right? Because you can just see. So he's like, I'm so glad you hugged me because I was going to hug you anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, just so cute. And so it was this beautiful family who, you know, like, I get it. Like, people are told what to do.
Sure.
And, you know, sometimes we lose track of the why, but the why is the core of our being. Right. And so for this family, it was this almost religious experience. And that may not be the case for everyone, but what it really helped me to see is, like, this isn't just something that's on paper. This isn't just a policy document. This isn't just a funding formula.
Sure. It's fluid. It fills in the gaps of...
This is a part of who we are as people.
Right.
And so, like, their daughter, who's 3, is going through the motions of this life. And so if you ask me, like, kind of what my vision is that families and teachers and government officials and all of the people that are needed to make inclusion happen, that you realize that we cannot do the what unless we know that this is the why of this is not just for efficiency. It's not even just because of human rights. It's because this is who we are as a person.
Right.
This is a spiritual connection to whatever you think is.
Sure.
It's the core of who we are as humans.
Because it's good.
It is good.
It is good. It's as simple as that. It is
the
good.
Right thing to do.
Right. I think I love that because it's the right thing to do because
we are good.
Everyone deserves to be part of it.
Yeah.
Like, and it being life. Right. No one should be excluded from life.
No. And you know what? It's going to be hard to get there. And it is hard to get there.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And we're going to have to try and change people's minds.
When you saw his eyes tear up, what was your initial thought?
I think to, like, you know, because we come from a very, very faithful upbringing.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean? And even for me, sometimes you get wrapped up in the whole work thing and you kind of lose track of do I believe in what I'm doing? Like, in general, whatever your belief systems are. And, like, we grew up to be kind and loving and patient and all of these incredible traits that aren't specific to the faith that we grew up in, right? But sometimes you get so lost in the day-to-day busyness of life and the day-to-day busyness of inclusion that you kind of forget that, like, wait a second, like, let's just take a step back for a second and be like, we're doing this for a reason that is so much bigger than all of this.
Right. I think it's actually, that story is a great example because the work of inclusion and gaining understanding and helping it evolve and develop is to approach it with love, right? That's
it.
And to approach it with a view that, you know, this is good. This is good for people. This is good for us, and it's out of love that we do it. Yeah. So I think that's a good.
No, totally, and I appreciate that it's still going to require resources and funding and time and all of those things.
Right.
But if we get lost in the resources and funding and things,
then it becomes
a gatekeeper.
The bureaucracy of every.
Totally. It's like, well, we can't do this unless we have funding. Well, no, that's not true.
No, we can do it because it's good.
We can do it because it's good.
We can do hard things.
And we are also going to advocate for funding. We are also going to advocate for resources. But we cannot say, it's like saying I can't love until I have resources.
Right.
I can't be joyful until I have resources. Like, these are competencies that are not reliant on anything.
Right.
And so I guess that moment was really, that's my vision, is that inclusion to people is like asking them why, like, how do you feel that water is wet?
Sure.
Well, what do you mean?
Right.
I don't know any different because this is just who we are.
Right.
This is just a part of who we are.
It's your initial reaction.
Yeah. It's really like, well, because this is just this.
Sure.
Right. And kids answer it like that. But adults, we still don't answer it like that.
Right.
So that is the wrap up too. But the books are going to help with the how, because we can't just live in the clouds and la la land of belief systems.
No, we have to take
the action and the implementation, which I totally appreciate. People may not know how to do.
Great.
And so that is what the goal of the partner books are for.
All
for one for all.
There we go.
Whoo, 3-hour podcast done.
There you go. So listeners,
yes,
take a second, think about what your vision for inclusion is. How do you want to see the why and how that connects to your heart, because I think that's an important thing. That was your whole story is understanding the why and keeping that
central,
because it's easy to get the head overtake the heart.
It's so easy. It's in both sides. It's easy to get lost in the why. It's easy to get lost in the how. It's bringing those things together that we need to make this happen.
I've worked for a lot of nonprofits over my lifetime, and it's funny when a nonprofit, they're heart companies, but then they start getting run like head companies.
Yes.
And it totally you lose the heart.
You lose the
it's the soft part. So keep the why the focus, and
it's the right thing to do.
It's the right thing to do.
Done.
Awesome.
Do good always.
So let's wrap this up. What do you want people to know right now? What's some current events that we can current events, but
things
current,
that I think we should mention that we kind of mentioned is go check out the book lists, the recommended resources,
and links for that are on Twitter,
Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. They're all there. So go take a look at resources. I've been adding to them as I get more recommendations. So go take a look at those.
I heard you've been designing some T-shirts.
I've been designing some T-shirts.
Sure.
iPhone cases.
Sure. I think I was waiting for a script, and I said, Shelley, is that script ready? And you said, oh, I'm designing a T-shirt.
We get there eventually.
We'll get there. Sure.
So I think those are two things to look out for. We're going to keep working on some content.
More content,
and then we're just gonna keep on going on.
Great. And I think watch out for a survey. We're gonna create a survey to ask people some questions. What do
you want to hear about?
I want to hear people's stories. And what's connecting. Because I want to look at that and see maybe there's something we could do more of.
Send your questions.
Send your questions.
Totally. I have a nice bank of questions that are starting to come in. Great. That we're gonna have a little question corner.
We can make another podcast.
So many podcasts.
All right.
Okay, everyone. Have a great March.
Am I sending everyone off? Or
you sign everybody. You're the host.
I'm the host this time. Okay. So I want to thank everyone for listening. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed to this podcast, please do. Just if you're listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever you take your podcasts in, just subscribe. Subscribe to YouTube. Connect on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
All the things.
All the socials. And thanks for listening, and we'll talk to everyone real soon.
So soon. Bye, friends.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the 5 More Minutes podcast. The 5 More Minutes podcast is produced by Shelley Moore and Paul Madsen, and you can find 5 More Minutes on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and wherever you find your podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We'll see you next time.